Welcome everybody to the third seminar of the Southeast Asia Research Center of the semester, which we're very pleased about. I'll be introducing the speaker in a second, but I'd like to advertise our next talk, which is by a very distinguished professor from the mainland, Professor Malay, who is the chief expert of One Road, One Belt, One Road, the 100 Forum, and professor at the Institute for International Strategic Studies in Beijing, and of course, for those of you who've been following this discussion, a very interesting issue in terms of how it will affect Southeast Asia, which will be his topic. That's on the 28th, a Monday, the 28th. What time is it, Irene? 4 p.m. And the room is? Lecture Theater 9. Okay, very good. So you're all invited to that. Of course, we'll be up on the CERC site soon. But without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker today. We're very pleased that Professor Ramon Guillermo is here with us today. He's a professor of Philippine Studies at the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, the premier university in the Philippines. He's the author of a number of works, including on indigenization theory, which has been a very important and controversial debate, and he's made several key contributions to this: translation studies, digital philology. He's worked on such scholars as the late Benedict Anderson, the subject of his talk today, and also worked on a translation, works on a translation of Isabelo de los Reyes. That's a talk I heard you give in Hawaii about a year ago. He's a wide-ranging intellectual. What he does is cutting edge, and it's very exciting to have him here, and I find it's fitting that he's talking about a subject on Indonesia, a Filipino revisiting Ben Anderson's The Language of Indonesian Politics. So he's got a comparative Southeast Asian perspective, and again, Woman, we're very pleased that you could be with us today, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So, thanks for the invitation about this afternoon. My topic is we're going back to a very old essay by Benedict Anderson, The Languages of Indonesian Politics. I think one of his essays, an early essay also, was much more popular, the one on Javanese power, and that had a lot of influence on Philippine scholarship in the area of trying to find out indigenous concepts of power. Now I want to go into this other essay, which I think allows us a different perspective on late 19th century Philippines. So the title of my talk is Revolusi, as in Indonesian, the way that the Indonesians borrowed revolution, and revolucion, that's how it was borrowed in Filipino or Tagalog. So we're going to try to revisit the method and the idea behind this essay, The Languages of Indonesian Politics. So I just want to go over certain methodological points from Ben Anderson. So in this very early essay, he says that no one has yet attempted to look at the language of contemporary Indonesia as an enterprise for the mastery of a gigantic cultural crisis, and a partly subconscious project for the assumption of modernity within the modalities of an autonomous and autochthonous social political tradition. And he asks the central question of this essay: how has revolutionary Malay set about the task of disciplining and uniting the, number one, bureaucratic colonial vocabulary, number two, the Western democratic socialist vocabulary, and number three, the nationalist revolutionary vocabulary, and that of, number four, the Javanese tradition. So this is the concept of revolutionary Malay. And I think this concept, with its four components, can also be used not just to study Indonesia, but also the Philippines and other, I think, Southeast Asian countries, in the way that they built their political thinking, their political ideas and vocabularies after the period of independence. So Anderson goes into the project of what was revolutionary Malay. So he said what was needed was a counter language to Dutch, a modern nationalist language which would in itself re-establish the connection with Indonesian traditions without compelling each individual to master the crisis internally through a bilingual conquest. Because this was the way by which the early Indonesian nationalist elite were able to develop their nationalist ideas, by becoming bilinguals, by absorbing Dutch, speaking Malay, and bridging this kind of these languages all the time. So they had to become bilinguals. But the spread of Indonesian as a national language was only possible once Dutch had become the inner language of the intelligentsia. Only then could Indonesian be developed to receive the new thinking. So his point here was that you think in Dutch while speaking in Malay, right? So you're now, if you think in Dutch while you're speaking in Malay, eventually Malay becomes dominant. Eventually Dutch becomes superfluous. You wouldn't need Dutch anymore because everything that you wanted to say in Dutch, you could now say in Malay, empirically, yes, for all intents and purposes. So I just want to rephrase Ben Anderson's question for a Philippine problem. How did revolutionary Tagalog of the late 19th century set about the task of disciplining and uniting, number one, the bureaucratic colonial vocabulary, number two, the Western anarchist socialist vocabulary? So you can see the difference here, right? Number two, the Western democratic socialist vocabulary. That was in the 40s, 30s, right? But you have in the Philippines the anarchist socialist vocabulary. I think you've read some of Ben's writings on Philippine anarchism during this early period. So it was indeed true that there were anarchist ideas coming from Spain, and these were being imbibed by Filipino intellectuals. Number three, the nationalist revolutionary vocabulary, and that of number four, Tagalog tradition. So we're trying to reframe the problem of revolutionary Malay as revolutionary Tagalog, right? So I'm not talking about revolutionary Filipino as in the national language, because that had not yet existed in the turn of the century. So we're just going to talk about revolutionary Tagalog in the same way that Ben was speaking of revolutionary Malay. So it's like thinking in Spanish while speaking in Tagalog. That's also part of the construction of revolutionary Tagalog. And I'm going to go through some translations of certain important works in politics and in the thinking of the period, so that we can look at how the language began to modernize itself, began to absorb Western political ideas through the laboratory of translation, because that's the easiest path that we can take at this moment. But we're going to look at a specific example first, because it's going to be very difficult if we're going to look at the whole vocabulary for revolutionary Tagalog. It's really going to be a lot to discuss, but I think that's a longer term project, is to really look at the vocabulary for revolutionary Tagalog in the same way that Ben looked into the vocabulary for revolutionary Malay and tried to reconstruct this vocabulary. But and I think Ben introduces here a useful idea of looking into vocabularies as entities which we can study. And I'm trying to merge this with some other approaches, like conceptual history, from Koselleck, etc. But we have to fix it from, we have to fix the theoretical questions first, right? So we're going to look at an example of revolutionary Tagalog, a very old word, tao. So what does tao mean? It means human being or person, right? So if you've studied a bit of Tagalog, then that's what tao means. So we're going to look at the Austronesian cognates of tao. So you see it's spread out all over Southeast Asia. The tao, tau, tao, tau, right? So it's in Proto-Austronesian kau, means person or human being. So it's spread out all over Southeast Asia, and it's even in Guam over there, right? So very interestingly, over there in Orchid Island near Taiwan, the indigenous groups there, the Austronesian groups, also call themselves Tao. In fact, that's what they call themselves, and other people aren't Tao, and they call their island Pongso no Tao. That means the island of the Tao, right? So that's over there, Batanes, and Orchid Island, and then you have also here in Sulawesi, you know, and in Papua New Guinea, over there. So Tao is a bit of an ancient concept, a very old word that's spread out all over Southeast Asia. So let's look at the first printed occurrence of Tao or Tao in Tagalog. So that's 1593, the oldest Tagalog book that was printed in the Philippines. Right? So this is the Doctrina Cristiana en lengua española y Tagala. So it's a bilingual book. It has a Spanish part, it has a Tagalog part. And it's also a biscript book because it has two scripts, the Roman alphabet and the so-called Baybayin writing system, which is also an Indian-derived writing system, similar to those that you find in Sulawesi, in Java, etc., in other parts of Southeast Asia. So this is one of the examples of where Tao shows up. This is Tao, right over there. And the phrase is kapwa mo tao. That means your fellow human being, right? So it's just saying that wag mo patayin ang kapwa mo tao. Don't kill your fellow human being. It's just saying that. So this is a very interesting text. This is the oldest Tagalog book in the Philippines. So there are several occurrences of Tao in this book, and there's also the sense of pagkatao, the sense of being human, which is a kind of complex idea in Tagalog. I'm not sure if pagkatao here means the same as it does today, as it means like you have some kind of moral sense of caring for your fellow human being. I'm not sure, or if it just means kind of biological or kind of ontological sense of being human. So let's look at the old dictionaries. So we're just going over all these things, right? So because we're going through conceptual history. So if we look at the oldest dictionary, 1613, you know, it's just a common noun for hombre, persona. And what the Tagalog call themselves in contradistinction with other nations. So it's the same as in Orchid Island, where the people on that island call themselves Tao, and the others not Tao. For example, this sentence, Dili Tao at Castilla. That means that person isn't a Tao. He's a Spaniard. He's a Spanish guy. So there are other usages here. And then in 1860, the last big dictionary of the Spanish era, that was the first one, you see gente, yeah? May tao sa simbahan, there are people in the church. Walang tao sa bayan, there are no people in the town, right? So there are different usages here, and if you look at both of these usages, there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference between the 17th century and the 19th century usages. But there's an unusual usage of katauhan, but I won't go into that. It's just that it seems to be equated with humanidad, which is a very Christian idea. So humanidad, a Christian idea, I think they invented a word, katauhan, to sort of serve as the equivalent for Tagalog speakers.
But you don't find in the older one the specific that it's only referring to Tagalog people.
Yes, in the older one.
So this was...
Yes, this is the older one. You find it.
Because you said there's not much difference between the both ones,
Yes,
but then
yes.
this también lo toman
Yes.
estos Tagales por sí mismo,
Yes.
there it seems it has changed.
I think it does. That particular aspect, but
Yeah.
other aspects,
Okay.
they're generally the same. It's just that in the early phase, you know, they did call themselves Tao, and the others, you know, you're Spaniard, you're not a Tao. Eventually, I think Tao would become a broader concept that it would be used for all human beings, regardless. So let's look at we're now speeding into the 19th century. So in the late 19th century, in 1886, 1887, Jose Rizal was in Germany, and he was studying German, and his brother, Paciano Rizal, who was an activist, a nationalist activist, he asked Jose Rizal, you know Jose Rizal, Philippine hero, national hero.
Who lived in Hong Kong
He did, yeah, for a time.
twice. He was here.
So, yes, and his brother Paciano asked him, you know, Pepe, that was his nickname. Can you translate Wilhelm Tell into Tagalog? Because it was known as a nationalist play, that extolled revolution, the fight against colonial domination. So Pasiano thought perhaps we could use this play to dramatize the plight of the Filipino people, the Tagalogs, so that in our town we could show this play and use it for propaganda purposes. So Jose Rizal tried his best to translate this into Tagalog. This is his longest work in Tagalog, and it was translated from German into Tagalog of that era. Now you can imagine how difficult that would be. That you would have this German language which was filled with the ideas of the European Enlightenment, with the ideas of the modern ideas of political revolution. In fact, Wilhelm Tell was at one time called the agit propaganda play of German idealism, right? Because it had all of the elements of the German Enlightenment, Aufklärung, and it had also the sense of nationalism that could be used by anti-colonial revolutionaries. So when Jose Rizal did the translation, you can imagine how difficult that would be to translate these kinds of European concepts into Tagalog of the late 19th century, with no clear equivalents in political terms.
But from which language did he translate? From
From
German?
From German.
Wow.
Yeah.
You spoke Tell.
So no, sorry. This is very, very dark. These are the pages from some. I mean, I could, sorry, it's too dark. So, but these are pages from that translation. It's handwritten. And let's just go into an example here. Tao again, right? So, if you look at the German concepts, you would see here the usual concepts for German nobility, right? Master, Herr, Ritter, Adel, und Edel. No. Adel, Edel, nobility, the nobility. So he translated these concepts as Tao, but Tao as in with additional words like mataas na tao, as in high-born people, or mahal na tao, as in people who are honorable, very high in society. So he used Tao instead of using the Tagalog concepts of nobility, which there were also Tagalog concepts of nobility. And then, more or less unproblematically, he would translate Leute, man, also as Tao, quite consistently. They mean similar to Tao. Their meaning is similar. Mensch, yeah, that's a more complex idea. And if you put Menschlichkeit, that's even more complex, because Menschlichkeit would mean something like the capacity to show, to care for your fellow human being. So it's not just you're talking about human beings in general, but this kind of sense of caring for one's neighbor, which was also part of the sense of the Christian concept of this idea, which was the oldest meaning of Menschlichkeit. And then later you'd have Menschlichkeit only meaning something like human beings in general. Mensch, as in pointing out to human beings in general, not necessarily to any theological background. So Rizal translated this as pagkatao. Pagkatao. That means, pagka means to be Tao. That is when you are genuinely a Tao, when you have Menschlichkeit. Now, a very strange thing that happens in this translation is Natur, nature, is translated also as pagkatao. Now this is quite strange because Schiller's Wilhelm Tell is filled with concepts like Naturrecht, natural law, right? And also the natural condition of human beings. A very important idea in European political thinking, the natural state of man. And then you'd have nature, natural law. So Rizal translates nature as pagkatao, being human. Now why is that so? Because as with many other Asian languages, there wasn't any word for nature in Tagalog. And that's not unusual for other Asian languages. The development of the concept of nature was a particularly European idea. And this would eventually generate a lot of equivalents in various languages all over the world. But in the late 19th century, Tagalog did not have any concept of nature per se. Later words would be invented to become the equivalent of nature. But we'll go into that later. Well, also, burger. Now this is a bit of another complex idea in German, because it's kind of different from the usual. In English, you'd have citizen and bourgeois, you know, but in German it sort of conflates both of them. The burger is both the citizen, citoyen, and then the bourgeois. So he translates it only as tao. Now, a burger, of course, it's a complex European idea pertaining to citizenship, pertaining to certain kinds of rights, etc. But it's only translated as tao. So this represents a kind of difficult process of translation, but I did discuss this in another longer study about the whole process of translating Wilhelm Tell into Tagalog. But you can already see how difficult it is for tao to span the idea of nature, that it's an almost impossible task. So this is an example also from that book, from that translation. So Schiller wrote, Der alte Urstand der Natur kehrt wieder, wo Mensch den Menschen gegenübersteht. That means the ancient state of nature returns. Alte Urstand der Natur. That is the ancient state of nature. Now, in Tagalog, you can see the translation is, nagbabalik ang matandang lagay ng lupa kapag sa tao humahad lang ang kapwa-tao. The ancient condition of the land returns. There is no idea of nature in this. But that is arguably a very central passage in Wilhelm Tell's in the work Wilhelm Tell. That, you know, that state of nature returns, and then this is the revolution that we're going to undertake. You know, but you know that's totally gone in this translation. So it had a different ideology. It had a different way of framing revolutionary ideas. We won't go into that, but you can already see the difficulties that Rizal was going through in trying to translate a classic text of European nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, into Tagalog. Let's go into another example of translation, kind of bureaucratic. You know, the second part of Ben's thesis, the bureaucratic vocabulary. So let's look at the first constitution ever written for the Philippines in 1898. That was written by Apolinario Mabini, right? So we're going to look at Apolinario Mabini's self-translation of his Programa Constitucional de la República Filipina, which he translates as panukala sa pagkakana ng Republika ng Pilipinas. Now, for Filipinos today, that would be quite a funny title, pagkakana. But you know, I think at the time it was an acceptable title. So Apolinario Mabini was part of Aguinaldo's revolutionary government. If you've heard of Apolinario Mabini, he was one of the guys who never consented, who was the last to surrender to U.S. rule in the Philippines. And in fact, he was exiled to Guam, where the people also spoke about Tao, you know, for some time, because he refused to swear allegiance to the American flag. Yes. But before his death, he did want to go back to the Philippines, so he did eventually swear to it, but he died quite soon after. So these are the title pages of this book. So you'd have it published in Cavite, 1898, both of them 1898. Right? So this is the first draft Philippine Constitution of the revolution. So you'd expect in a constitution you'd have all of the vocabulary you would need to run the state, right? Or at least most of the vocabulary you need to run the state. So it does have a lot. The Congress, the Senate, etc. It does have it had a whole vocabulary, the Tagalog translation to transmit to Tagalog all of these bureaucratic state concepts into Tagalog. But I'm not going to all of it. It's too much. It's a lot of ideas. I just want to read Mabini's introduction to this book. To the President of the Revolutionary Government, I, Apolinario Mabini, respectfully approaches and narrates the following, because it is not unknown to him that in this time of national crisis, that each one who lives in the Philippines has a duty to contribute wholeheartedly in the pursuit of the extremely difficult work of revolution. And he is also aware of the need of the people, or the bayan, to have even just a little understanding of the conditions and ways of life of an independent nation in order to decide more intelligently. Has written a small book entitled Proposed Constitution of the Philippine Republic. So he wants the people to understand, just to have a little understanding of what it is to be independent. That was the point of this translation. You couldn't have a revolution if the people didn't understand what they were up to. You'd have to make them understand what it was about. So we'll just go into Tao again. We won't go into the other, also so many other concepts in this translation. So, Tao is used to translate hombre. Yeah, quite clear. Los deberes del hombre, the duties of man, is translated as katungkulan ng tao. Very direct translation. La vida humana, kabuhayan ng tao. Yes, also very direct translation. Pueblo, taong bayan. Now that's still used up to today, taong bayan. You can hear that when there are rallies and there are demonstrations. Taong bayan is still current. But the more interesting one is the individual, which you'd expect to be in a constitution, in the individual. So individual is just translated as Tao in the text. Well, so you'd have derechos individuales, individual rights. It's translated just katwirang kinikilala dito, which are the rights which are recognized here. There's no concept of the individual there. You would also see that katwiran, which is a translation for rights here, is a transitional concept. But during the time they were using katwiran as a translation for rights. Rizal didn't actually have any direct translation for rights. When he was translating Schiller's Wilhelm Tell into Tagalog, it was also non-existent, that kind of concept also. So natural law in Wilhelm Tell, Naturrecht, could not be translated at all. Both words in that compound word had no Tagalog translation. Cada individuo, each individual, is rendered as isa't isa, each one. Los individuos, ang mga tao. Consciencia de cada individuo, consciència ng bawat tao. You can see here that individual just vanishes. The individual just merges with the Tao in general. So you would also see, if you look at the Indonesian Constitution of 1945, that there's also no individual in that constitution. You'd see a lot of tiap-tiap warga negara, as in each citizen, but there's also no individual in the first Indonesian constitution. So now we go to a more complex case. This is a translation of an Anarchist pamphlet into Tagalog. So this is I think the first full translation of an Anarchist work into Tagalog. It was published in 1913. It's by Erico Malatesta. And in Spanish, the title is Entre Campesinos, right? So how did that get to the Philippines, and why was it translated into Tagalog? So if you've heard about Isabel dos Reyes, I think Ben Anderson wrote quite a bunch about Isabel dos Reyes. He was a Filipino revolutionary, Ilocano, not Tagalog, and he was exiled to Spain because of his revolutionary activities in the late 19th century. When he came back, he brought with him books, and these books were Marx, Bakunin, Proudhon, Malatesta, all these anarchists and Marxists that he brought with him in a suitcase to the Philippines. And then in 1902, shortly after his return, he founded the first Filipino labor union, La Unión Obrera Democrática. So there is some truth to Ben's thinking that there were some anarchist ideas circulating in the Philippines in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, to the point that it was found necessary to translate one of these major pamphlets of anarchist thinking. This pamphlet was particularly popular in Spain. There were so many reprintings of Entre Campesinos in Spanish. It was a classic of anarchist thinking. And they say that it was used also to draft the constitution of the first labor union in the Philippines, aside from Marx. So Marx and Malatesta, their ideas were combined to sort of write down the first constitution of the first Philippine labor organization. And this is the Tagalog translation over here. So you can see they just have pseudonyms here. Tambuli wrote the foreword, and Cabisang Tales, these are pseudonyms, but we actually know the people. This is Arturo Soriano, who translated this, a labor leader of the time. So let's look at the problem in translating Tao here. So hombre with rights, like derecho, would be translated as Tao, Taong may karapatan. Karapatan now is the modern concept of rights. So in Mabini, it had not yet been current. It was not yet current. Also with Jose Rizal, not yet current. But this is the modern idea of right, karapatan. Taong may karapatan, hombre, no? And then you have gente, tao also, persona, tao, poblacion, and humano. So we saw earlier Menschlichkeit. We have here, we have the duty of the human being. You have the human genre, the human species. And then you have the human well-being. These were translated as pagkatao or pagpapakatao, as in Jose Rizal's translation also of Menschlichkeit, right? But more difficult is the other translations. You'd see individuo, which had a connection, as we see here, in Malatesta's Spanish translation of, of course, the original was Italian, but this is the Spanish translation of Malatesta's work. You'd see individual collocates very frequently with propiedad, with property. Propiedad individual. Propiedad individual. So this is like Macpherson's concept of the possessive individualist. That the construction of the individual had something to do with the notion that you had property and that you owed nothing to society for this property. And this is how the individual arose in European thinking. It was closely connected to propiedad, closely connected to rights and society. So you can see here, the translation of individuo is once again elided. There is no translation. It just says, pagmamay-ari ng tao. Right? So the individual just refuses to surface, right, in this, from Jose Rizal to Mabini to this translation of Malatesta. Now, interestingly also, there wasn't any concept for sociedad, society, at the time. So how would you write it? Pagsasamahan ng tao. That's why, if you look at the title here, it's so small, mahalagang salitaan ukol sa pagsasamahan ng mga tao. Two peasants, an important dialogue about society, pagsasamahan ng mga tao. So, to invent the idea of sociedad, society, you just say, pagsasamahan ng mga tao, people coming together. Sama to come together. And then, social, also no equivalent concept. You just have pag-aayos o pagsasamahan ng mga tao. Also pagsasamahan, coming together again, of people. Sistema, also no concept yet. And you'd have panuntunan, or the regulations of human of being together. Revolusyon, pagbabagong ayos ng tao. That is fixing, ordering things up in a new way for people. So you can see that Tao was a generative idea. It was trying to express all of these new ideas in Western or European political thinking. So the translator of this work, he was trying to use the Tao idiom to express these notions of society, revolution, social system, etc. Because they had no direct equivalence yet. But Revolucion, of course, would have an equivalent. Bonifacio, Andres Bonifacio, the leader of the Philippine Revolution, used the word himagsikan. That's a very complex idea also. It comes from bagsik, which means to be really angry, right? To be really angry, yes. So this is how the individual sort of vanishes in these texts, but you generate a lot of other ideas. Now, let's go from revolutionary Tagalog to the national language. So we've seen that revolutionary Tagalog was in ferment. There were, I just showed you a few texts from that period. You would see a lot. There would be a lot more diversity also in trying to frame or trying to express European ideas. Now let's go into the development of revolutionary Tagalog into a national language. And we're now going to around the 30s, the 20s, up to the 60s, 70s. Right? So I'll just I'll show you some examples here. So I'm combining, we're going to use here some computer methods to try to analyze these texts, because these are big texts, so you can use computers to try to process them more easily, more quickly. So I'm going to go into the first writer, Lazaro Francisco. So we're going to put 4 of his novels, big novels, into our digital corpus. So we digitize all of them, put them into a digital corpus, and then this is around I think 400,000 words. Lazaro Francisco is one of the major writers in the Tagalog language, and he was a rather conservative thinker. Conservative in the sense that all social questions for him were to be reduced to moral questions. That social organization or social structure were actually for him irrelevant. What mattered was if people were good or bad. The moral questions were paramount for Lazaro Francisco. So that's a kind of classic conservative way of thinking. That you wouldn't question how society is arranged. You just talk about if the person was good or bad. You just needed good people to run society so that things would go well. So that was how Lazaro Francisco thought, although he did portray a lot of social struggle in his work. He was writing from during a whole period of unrest, agrarian unrest in the Philippines from the 30s to the 60s. A lot of revolutionary movements in the countryside, a lot of the Communist Party, etc. He was writing during that era. And then let's go to another part of our big corpus. So we'll go into the writings of Amado Hernandez. So Amado Hernandez is known to be, the paramount radical writer of the Philippines. So he wrote, this novel, Mga Ibong Mandaragit, that means birds of prey. Usually about the U.S. The U.S. is the bird of prey. And then Luha ng Buaya, that's the tears of the buaya, or the crocodile tears. And then the two sides of the coin here, essays, and these 2 novels. So what we're doing here is we're trying to combine both the left and the right, the conservative and the radical, into one big corpus, so that we can kind of go into an average, right, of how they used Filipino as a language. So Amado Hernandez, he was imprisoned for quite some time because he was the head of the biggest labor movement in the 60s. He was imprisoned for subversion, for being supposedly a member of the Communist Party. Both of them are national artists. They were given recognition as national artists. They were big. These are big writers in the Philippine canon. So now let's look at their. We're going to use kind of method here. It's collocational network analysis. Sorry about this. Going to be. I'm just going to discuss the method a bit. So this is collocation analysis. When you just use a digital corpus and then you use a program to list all the occurrences of a particular word, right? So you can use concordance software to do this. A lot of it is free. You can download it from the internet. Just get a concordance program, and then you put in the corpus, and then you can ask, how many times did this word appear and in which context? So karapatan here, which means right, would occur in this number of occurrences and in these kinds of contexts in the text. So this is very important for lexicography, you know, because those who make dictionaries, they want to look at all of the usages of a word. So they use this kind of concordance software. Now what we're going to do is a bit more complex. It's collocational network analysis. So we're going to start off with a seed word. And our seed word, as you may already surmise, is tao. So we're going to start with a seed word here. And then we're going to get the recognized significant collocates, meaning the neighbors of this word, 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right. And then we're going to go down, and then we're going to get the collocates 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right. We're going to do this 5 times. So we're going to produce a kind of tree. Right? We're going to iterate 5 times. So this is the product of this, of this big corpus. Here is tao, right? So you can see here the thickness of the line. It means how strong the interconnection is between these ideas. So we're looking at a kind of encyclopedia of Filipino political language here. And this spans the 20s to the 70s. Now this looks like it's a very important word. But in fact, it's the second most important word, or it's the most important word here because it has the most number of connections. It's bayan, meaning people or nation, right? It's also a very old word, an Austronesian word. It's not a borrowed idea. Here we have tao here, which has a second number of connections, second largest number of connections. But we have here a kind of box. Then we have a box here. So I'll explain these boxes. Okay, we're going to zoom in to the box. Tao connects to loob. That means the inner self. It's a very moral idea in Tagalog, the inner self. Kalooban also, which is from loob, but it sort of means the will. Also a very moral idea. And then you have kapwa, how would you translate kapwa, which is the fellow human being or something like that. It's almost untranslatable, these ideas. We'd have to talk for a long time so that we can understand what it actually means in Tagalog. And then utang na loob, another debt of gratitude. These are somewhat moral ideas. So Tagalog, tao connects with these moral concepts of kapwa, kalooban, matwid, loob. Now, as kapwa here, which means fellow human being, if you look back, it connects very strongly to bayan. So you can see that kapwa sort of functions to sort of socialize the idea of tao. The tao is something like just a single person. But if it connects with kapwa, that means, it's already connecting with another person. And this connection, which is a very moral connection, which means that, you have to treat your fellow human being in a humane way. You have to care for that person, It connects now to bayan. Now, bayan is our transition to the whole range of political concepts in Tagalog. Bayan, which connects to kalayaan, freedom. Now, when Rizal was translating Wilhelm Tell, he came upon the word in German, Freiheit. Freiheit, freedom in English. And he was stumped. He said, I can't think of any word in Tagalog which means the same as Freiheit, he said. So he asked around, he even looked at the older Tagalog text, he couldn't find an equivalent. But he asked some of his friends, and some of them came up with what seemed to be a rather newly minted word, kalayaan. So kalayaan is a new word, relatively new word. Karapatan, as we've seen, that's rights, also a very new word. Katarungan, that's justice. Tarong means it comes from Cebuano, straight, right? So also a new word. Lipunan, society, also a very new word. Mamamayan, citizen, also a very new word. And katwiran, reason. This is a modern representation of reason and rationality. So you have here a box in which you'd have the moral ideas, and then you'd have a box here where you have the political ideas. And you would see that if you look at the ethical-moral cluster, this is it. And then you have tao, kapwa. Now this connects with, so when you're talking about moral things, when you're talking in ethical moral terms, the usual transition is through this idea. From kapwa it goes now to bayan, and then you go into a lot of these other political ideas. So you can have a mediating term because we're not talking about the separation of the moral and the political. We're talking about how they are imbricated in each other, how they relate to each other, inextricably. So, but as you can see, the moral, ethical categories, they're older categories. In fact, they're very difficult to translate into other languages. Now, the political words, they were in fact designed to be translated. They were in fact created so that they could easily correspond to modern European political ideas. But we began with Tao, and Tao sort of spun out. For example, Sociedad. The translator tried to create out of the Tao idiom equivalents for European ideas. So if you look at the whole process, it was a process of breaking the bounds of the Tao idiom. The Tao is a much older discourse, surrounded by a moral, ethical world. And you can see now, Rizal translated natur as pagkatao. Later on, it would become kalikasan, a newly invented word in the early 20th century. Sociedad, pagsasamahan ng tao, would become lipunan, a newly invented word once again. I think, in fact, lipunan became most current in the 70s. Sistema, well, panuntuan, rules of living together of people would become sistema later. Propiedad individual. There would be no individual would never really be successful in contemporary Filipino political language. Revolucion would be later, just revolucion, Nueva sociedad, the new society, bagong pagsasamahan ng tao, will have different meanings eventually. But as you can see, it was a whole process. The creation of revolutionary Tagalog was a process in which there was an effort to translate all of these ideas of political modernity into pre-existing idioms. And these pre-existing idioms were primarily of a, revolving around Tao, were primarily of a moral, ethical nature, kind of moral economy. But in the process of developing this new discourse, the Tao idiom would be considered insufficient. So this whole idiom would be surpassed, and new and more definite equivalents would be found for these European ideas. These would be created in the early 20th century. So these these political ideas are generally new creations. And today, some of them are more popular. Some of them are still abstract, not well understood. Some terms wouldn't even be very popular, like individual in Tagalog. And for example, when people talk about karapatan or rights, that's even something that I don't think that has an idea that has deeply penetrated Filipino thinking, or a lot of thinking from a lot of Filipinos. The way that they think don't really involve the idea of rights or karapatan. So it's still a process of less than 100 years in which these ideas have been fermenting, have been developing in the Philippine context. So if we go deeper into this, or make a kind of broader analysis, then we can already see how it would go. We could actually develop a kind of political lexicography of the Filipino language starting from the late 19th century. And you could also imagine that this kind of process could be used to analyze other Asian experiences. You know, how contact with European modernity introduces this kind of force, this kind of tension, and generates more or less a kind of homogenizing force on different political languages. But a homogenizing force that could never be complete, that could never actually completely homogenize the receptor languages of these political idioms. So, so when Ben Anderson was talking about this, when he was using this for studying Indonesian political modernity, I think he hadn't done enough yet. I think more could be done in Indonesian, Malay political lexicography, also in Philippine political lexicography. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much for that fascinating talk and the sophisticated methodology, but also the comparative focus. If I could abuse my power as chair to just ask you to provide a little bit of context, because you talk about the revolutionary Malay, the Bahasa Indonesia example of from Dutch to Bahasa. But of course in the Philippines it's more complicated because it's Spanish to Tagalog and then English gets mixed up thanks to US colonialism. And add to the fact that basically Spanish was being spoken by the elite through much of the American colonial era, but then English comes particularly through the schools, and that affects, of course, particularly elite thinking. To a certain extent, there's a mass, base of English speaking, but I'm just wondering how that sort of mixes things up a bit in terms of your analysis.
That makes it different. That's why there were different degrees of success. Revolutionary Malay successfully became a Bahasa Indonesia, a very dominant national language in Indonesia. And most people in Indonesia speak Bahasa Indonesia. And for all kinds of, for all areas of knowledge, in education, in politics. But what happened in the Philippines is, as Mark pointed out, is a rather more complex situation in which Filipino as a national language does not enjoy the same success as Bahasa Indonesia does in Indonesia. And that's partly due to the American interruption of this process. So let's go into some kind of detail into this. So you'd have a small Spanish-speaking elite in the Philippines in the late 19th century, probably just as small as the Dutch-speaking elite in Indonesia. And they were trying to transmit these new ideas with respect to the revolution, also, but they weren't completely separated. They weren't completely insulated or isolated from the ordinary people. They were actually trying to mobilize a lot of the Filipino masses to revolt against Spanish rule, and they were successful to a certain extent. And at the turn of the century, there was a lot of expectation that that a national language could be generated out of this. A nationalist national language could be generated out of this, because a lot of the intellectuals of that era, even though they were coming from different ethnic groups, they were not Tagalogs. They were already using Tagalog to translate and think in terms of the nation. So you'd have examples like Aurelio Tolentino, a foremost playwright in Tagalog, who was actually Kapampangan. You'd have Isabel de los Reyes, an Ilocano, who was writing a lot of things in Tagalog. Because that was the expectation, that there would be some kind of single language which would express all of these new ideas and experiences. So the problem was when the first generation of Filipino intelligentsia were educated under the American regime. So you'd have a kind of period of transition in which a lot of Filipino intellectuals once spoke Spanish. Many were writing now already in Tagalog or in other Filipino languages, with the expectation that this language would be dominant eventually. But the American imposed educational system created a new generation of intelligentsia. A new generation of intelligentsia. As you know, I came from the University of the Philippines. It was founded in 1908. You'd only need one generation of those people trained in the University of the Philippines, so that you could create enough intellectuals who would write, think, and express themselves in English. And then English would become the dominant language, the most prestigious language in the Philippines. In the 1930s, 1920s, it would take over and suppress any kind of hegemonic potential for the revolutionary Tagalog. But the writers I showed you earlier, Amado Hernandez, Lazaro Francisco, they weren't elite writers. They weren't educated in the universities like that. They were native Tagalog speakers. They were the finest speakers and writers in Tagalog of their generation. They weren't very westernized, actually. And yet, when you look at what they were writing, they were already integrating so many of these modern ideas into the language of their works, and with the expectation that people would be able to understand what lipunan meant, society, what karapatan meant, rights, what mamamayan means, to be a citizen. So they were using this language in a very natural way. So it wasn't as if they were using an invented language. They were using a language that would become vital also, but a language that was no longer the primary language of the Filipino intelligentsia. It would be the language of Filipino movements, or labor movements, peasant movements, etc.
I have 3 questions. First of all, a very simple one. In your map at the beginning, you showed where Tao was used, or in the sort of eastern parts of Austronesian world. I didn't see Javanese or Malay in that map. Does that reflect the reality?
Manusian. So they would the most dominant in Malay would be Manusia, and that would be also in Java, right? So I'm just referring to the closest cognates.
I was just wondering whether that was. Yeah.
I think
that brings me to the next question, because Rizal, if I understand you correctly, was very conscious of the essential unity of the Malay, in the broadest sense, world. So what really was his view about the use of, say, Malay rather than of Tagalog as a unifying language which could apply to the Philippines as a whole? I mean, in the same way that the Dutch were already using Malay for practical purposes as a national language in Indonesia, even though it wasn't the bureaucratic language.
Yeah, so Malay would also be some kind of lingua franca in the Philippines before before colonialism. But Rizal was a bit of a pioneer in thinking about a kind of pan-Malayan unity, because this would come about a bit later for Indonesians and Malaysians. Where did he get this idea from? He got it from German scholars like Wilhelm von Humboldt. These guys who thought up the sense of the Malayo-Polynesian language family. So he wasn't actually looking at any tradition of thinking about Malays interconnecting with each other, Malay civilizations. He was just looking at these European linguistic writings, which showed that there was a lot of commonality in these languages, and that they in fact constituted a language family. So it was rather more technical, more intellectual approach which Rizal had with respect to the idea of the Malay or the Malayo-Polynesian. Eventually, of course, we'd have a more racial concept, also a more distinct concept that Malaysians and Indonesians would have a greater basis for speaking of themselves as Malay, and would rather exclude Filipinos from this kind of discussion.
Why is that? I mean, it's ridiculous. In the National University of Singapore excludes Philippines from this Malay world. I mean, how can you tolerate this?
I think this year I was in a conference about the Malay world. It was held in Yogyakarta, and then they had a map. The Malay parts were colored red, and the Philippines wasn't colored at all. It was just the token Malay. Of course, they didn't even consider me Malay because of the modern conceptualization of Malay as having to be Muslim, right? That was the religious.
Well, yeah, but NUS even includes Madagascar, and it's Malay, which you can do as a stretch, but it's certainly not Muslim.
Yes, but that's why they don't even include Madagascar in their.
Well, I know that, but they do it NUS. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Rizal was a rather pioneer but it didn't have a living tradition. In fact, even in the Philippines, it isn't a living tradition to consider ourselves Malay. It's just something that you got taught in school. And then when you go to Malaysia or to Indonesia, then you'd have a shock because they wouldn't consider you Malay at all, in those countries. So, but I think Rizal was one of the first to actually think of this, aside from the Europeans, of course, who did label this whole bunch of people as Malay.
I have a question about language. I know nothing about Tagalog, but this one of the central issues, bayan, people, nation. In Turkish, bay and bayan means man and woman. So I was wondering if there's any linguistic relation.
Well, probably not, but
Yeah.
we could think about that.
Yeah, I don't know if there was any maybe Osmanic influence by trading. I know that like some Arab words were transferred from China, but I don't know about the trade relations there.
There have been studies about these concepts, these collective concepts like bayan, and you could refer to them. They actually point to an older point of origin rather than just they're actually now considered borrowings into Tagalog.
Sorry, short. In your lexical analysis, you somehow try to relate Tao and a set of political concepts like freedom, rights, and justice. It seems to refer to the fact that the authors actually think that human beings should have this kind of basic human rights or justice or kind of democracy. And I'm interested to know, because this is just a lexical analysis, how about in empirical cases? Do the Filipino, when they read this stuff, do they really connect these two concepts? I mean, are they so influential in their political thinking?
Yeah, I could go into that, but well, if you look at it empirically, you would think, for example, why is it that a certain kind of moral ethical discourse is so dominant in Philippine political language? And as we've seen with Lazaro Francisco, this kind of moral ethical language has a deeply conservative tone or direction to it, you know. What I was interested in was looking at how properly political ideas, how these ideas connected to this moral ethical world of language. So I wasn't really saying, that you have to get rid of all these moral ethical ideas. These are so traditional, and then they don't show us a proper way of looking at society. No, that's not the project. I was trying to look at how they imbricated each other, how they work upon each other, how they relate to each other. So I was in this world of discourse, you would see that if you were talking about in a moral ethical language, then how do you make a transition to the political sphere? So you would see here that that you'd have to do it through the socialization of tao, which is through the kapwa, which is also a moral ethical idiom, and then it goes into a more political direction, into a more political dynamic. So I was trying to look at it empirically as linguistic phenomena, but to look at it in reality, of course, that's another thing. To be able to express it is one thing, and to be able to realize it or actualize it in the world is also another thing. But this is as far as I was thinking. I was really thinking about Jose Rizal trying to translate natural law, natural rights into Tagalog. If you couldn't say something like natural law in Tagalog, then how could it actually exist in reality? Or how, in terms of people dealing with each other? Maybe it can, maybe it cannot. But being able to say it is an important thing. Being able to express it and being understood is also quite important. So I think this could open up. I think this is a very rather let's say a kind of distinct field of study, like when you look at the evolution and history of political concepts. But I think it can help us out in political analysis. It can help us out in looking at how political behavior happens. But it's a rather more specialized area when you look at it. So I'm thinking in terms of, for example, how Reinhard Koselleck in his Begriffsgeschichte or conceptual history, he tried to map out the history of German political language in several volumes, and this is indispensable for understanding German political culture.
Yeah, because I'm thinking
Yes.
of mapping the youth thought. I mean, the youth news or anything the youth in Hong Kong that they are reading or they are writing, because they are having a very radical thinking in terms of their political behavior. So that's why I have
This kind of new thinking
questions.
produces new relationships between ideas, new collocations, as they say. And some collocations will become stronger because of certain revolutionary events. And so this is not a static kind of representation. When certain things happen in society, like revolutions, then or certain kinds of disturbances occur, then these generate new connections, and sometimes these connections can become very powerful. Can actually influence thinking on a broad range.
Well, related to what Mark said, you just that through the Bahasa, it was through the Dutch as the medium, right? And Tagalog was through the Spanish, okay? But of course, Spanish is a Romance language, and Dutch, as far as I know, is a Germanic, right? Germanic language. And they have different connotations. Latin, Spanish comes from the Romance, and therefore Latin. And Latin is very heavy in moral and justice and all of those. Legal, for example. Roman law, for example. And so it's a, I wonder how they translated using these two different languages coming from different orientations, going to Bahasa or going to Tagalog. And then the other question I have is, can you please show your last slide?
Sorry.
Okay.
This one?
No, the last, that one. For example, loob, I would consider it, I would not even say inner self. I will just say inside. And even desire, I will not say kalooban. For me, it's nais. So I do not know, are you directing me to your own interpretation? Because, without you, if I just see the word loob, like masamang loob or all, I will never use the term. So where did you get the term, and how did you get to the term?
Well, lots of books have been written about loob in Tagalog. It's a very well studied indigenous idea, and people Filipinos have been struggling. Filipino thinkers, writers, philosophers have been struggling to translate it or to find a translation for it in other languages. So there is a whole range of possible equivalences. So these are just some of the recommended or just some of the equivalences in these books. Now if I try to show you all of the possible equivalences, all of the whole range and nuance of this concept, then we wouldn't actually have enough time to have that kind of discussion, including loob itself, right? So that's another topic that we'd have to go into. But my own research, I don't really have an ambition to go into the depths of that world. I want to understand this one more, the political categories. But that is indispensable to understanding this one at the bottom. But there's a lot of literature that's been written. Leonardo Mercado, Virgilio Enriquez, all of them have different takes on this. And I'm just sort of repeating certain aspects of their discussions. So it's not as if it was originally my own interpretation. It's from a whole world. It's from a whole literature that's been written around this kind of topic.
Yeah, more contemporarily, because this, especially loob, because this word was big in a play written by Paul Dumont, Pagliolitis kay Mang Serapio, okay, in which this was an important word, and he was asked, what does he mean by this word? I don't know if you, because this is not a very old play. This is more contemporary, considering what you have mentioned earlier in historical perspective. So in other words, how people understand people with something inside them, and how this is expressed, whether especially in the field of morality, whether it's bad or whether it's good. So that's why it kind of because also you put it together, loob ang kalooban, and then your translation is, as I said, I will never use those words to translate loob or kalooban. I don't know, maybe I'm just different, but I say my sources are, as I said, Pagliolitis. I studied that work because I thought that was a contemporary use of rights and justice and what is inner self in more contemporary society writing.
And if you look at Ray Leto's Passion and Revolution, if you're familiar with this work, loob is the central Tagalog concept there in that book. He never translates it.
He continues.
It is the central Tagalog idea in Passion and Revolution, but he never actually translates it. So I wrote an essay about this non-translation of law. Maybe you can look it up. It's in Philippine Studies. And because maybe it's so difficult, but it's actually, there are no untranslatable concepts. It's just the way that we try to explain it to each other. It may take a longer time than usual, but I don't think there are any actually untranslatable ideas. But the moral discourse, the moral language, is definitely much more difficult. This older language is much more difficult to translate than the political ones, which were actually designed to be translatable. Now, your point about yes, if you look at Jose Rizal's translation once again of Wilhelm Tell, it's very interesting. He just does. If he goes in nature, he translated it as pagkatao, right? He did, as being human. He also translates nature as loob. I think quite often in that translation, which makes it even more difficult to understand. So we have to look at all these kinds of this kind of phenomena. So now the other question you asked about Romance and Germanic languages. Well, I'd have to think about it more.
But and Rizal used his German.
Yes, he did
Yeah.
use, and German is also a very moral language, very deeply moral language, and I'd have to go into it much more deeper if I were going to think about what the difference is between the Spanish and the German and the English origins of words. Yes.
If I could just follow up on this, what you said at the end of your answer to my first question about, Tagalog is now, among other things, the language of revolutionary movements. So one of the interesting sort of implications of the different sort of linguistic trajectory of the Philippines, thanks to the second colonial period, is that Tagalog has that somewhat subversive character, and in the revolutionary movements, and also interestingly in popular culture, Tagalog is the movie of cinema, cine, and a self-respecting, at least until recently, a self-respecting middle upper class Filipino would not go to a Tagalog movie. I mean, this is changing a bit, but so it has that sort of. So if I can draw you into contemporary political discussions, Duterte's cussing in Tagalog.
Yeah.
And the implications that has, the kind of connection he can make with people, because he's using Tagalog to, of course he's cussing, that's the first point, but secondly he's using it in Tagalog. Do you see any sort of importance to that? The linguistic aspect of it?
Well, it's a kind of new phenomenon in Philippine political language, because Duterte himself is a rather new phenomenon. If you study the Philippine presidents, how they speak. If you begin, for example, with Erap Estrada, Estrada, who was a populist president
And a movie star.
A movie star. He delivered his lines. He talked in Filipino or Tagalog, and he sort of connected with the ordinary people. But he wasn't as vulgar as Duterte. In fact, the way that he spoke was a rather elegant style Filipino or Tagalog. And then you'd have something like a kind of elitist Tagalog, no, by President Aquino, for example, the president before Duterte. He spoke Tagalog in his speeches, in the State of the Nation addresses. He used Tagalog, but his Tagalog is a kind of very formal Tagalog. It's a kind of
Ateneo.
Educated.
so Mark knows all about this. It's a kind of very refined kind of Tagalog, that you would associate, for example, with a kind of upper class style of delivering Tagalog lines. Now, Duterte himself isn't very fluent in Tagalog. He's more fluent in Cebuano, in Bisaya, and he sprinkles his speeches. He talks a lot in English. He sprinkles it with the Tagalog and Bisaya. He uses lots of rough language. So I think this has to be studied as a kind of new phenomenon in terms of political leadership using Filipino as a language. So he sort of connects with people in this way. I mean, it's, you know, this is also a matter of convention, you know, as Mark knows himself when he came from a talk, from a lecture in which you know, the audience was divided about Duterte, you know, and I think the Philippines is the only place where everyone is a tard, you know, Duterte tard or a yellow tard, you know, and there's sort of no in between, right? So you'd have to, I think today, this is a matter of study and discussion also, how this language of Duterte sort of creates a different sense or feel in Philippine politics. It's a sort of opposite of what President Aquino, the way that President Aquino used Filipino. It's a kind of opposite. And it
Or
sort of
even Marcos,
shows.
when Marcos spoke Tagalog,
Yes.
but anyway, just an aside. Duterte's choice of cuss words is not even pure Tagalog.
Yes.
It's Spanish.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
borrowed-
not even pure Tagalog.
borrowed Spanish.
So I mean, you may think it's Tagalog. It's not Tagalog.
Spoken about the influence of English for the American, you know, occupation. What about the situation with Visayan now? I mean, Visayan now seems to be spoken by more people than it was, you know, 20, 30 years ago because of the movement of people, particularly into Mindanao and so on. Do you think this is going to make it more difficult in the future for Tagalog to become a genuinely national language and to drive out English as a medium of discourse at the political level?
Well,
Particularly now, perhaps, because
Yes.
Duterte is clearly Visayan in his whole ancestry.
yes, well, the notion that a nation has to have a single language is, I think, a European prejudice. You know, that I think there was a time that revolutionary Tagalog could have become a genuine national language, spanning the whole of the archipelago. The Philippines is a very populous country, one of the most populous countries in the world. It could have, there was a time when it could have, the revolutionary Tagalog could have spanned the whole of the archipelago, but I think given what has happened in the past, I think there must be a degree of acceptance that, you know, that we are actually a multilingual nation, and that there may be methods by which we can deal with these different languages and try to develop them and try to relate these languages to each other. Maybe there could be a stronger use of Cebuano or Bisaya in the south and in the Visayas, in the Visayan area, and then we'd have Filipino or Tagalog in some areas, and then in the north you'd have Ilocano, because these languages, if you look at the populations which speak these languages, they're bigger than a lot of European countries. And I think
but I mean, doesn't this contradict where we started, which was the Malay and the Indonesian? And Indonesia has been very successful. You know,
Yes.
You could have a Bahasa, but at the same time, people in Java speak Javanese or Sundanese and so on and so forth.
maybe we can have a kind of bridge languages, some kind of bridge language like Filipino and English in the Philippines, and then we have to develop Ilocano, Cebuano. These languages can also fend for themselves, can also develop into very rich literary and scientific languages in the future. So maybe we can think of a more multilingual kind of nation state in the future, rather than thinking of it in terms of a single language that has to be used throughout the archipelago. But generally, of course, Filipino can be used almost everywhere in the Philippines, to a certain degree of fluency. But Cebuano can be used very effectively in very many important situations in those areas also. So I think it's not they're not contradictory. I think we can also try to develop a kind of more multilingual notion of the nation, rather than going to the older path of just Filipino.
Well, on that note, that very interesting finale there, I wanted to thank you again for a fascinating talk.